Welcome to today's video, where we dive into the chilling world of urban legends. As a child, I was captivated by these eerie tales, each offering a unique snapshot of the fears and folklore of different cultures. From cautionary tales like the Black Volga to spine-tingling stories designed to scare us straight, these legends have a way of sticking with us. Today we're exploring one such legend, the Whispering Man. Set against the backdrop of a summer camping trip, this tale weaves together elements of fear, tradition, and the kind of suspense that keeps us on the edge of our seats. If you enjoy stories that send shivers down your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more eerie tales and legends. Let's unravel the mystery behind the Whispering Man together. As a child, I was fascinated by urban legends. Each and every one of them is a snapshot of the culture of an area, and these outrageous stories are told for one of several reasons. They can be based on a true story. The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs was based off of a murder in the 1950s and was widely spread during the 60s. They can be told to showcase the culture in an area. The couple who eats KFC because the wife is tired, which turns out to be Kentucky Fried Rat, is a story told to punish women who shirked their so-called womanly duties by joining the workforce instead of homesteading. They can be told to scare children into behaving correctly and listening to their parents. As the grandchildren of Eastern European immigrants, my brother and I were terrified of the Black Volga, a black car that kidnapped and murdered children who talked to strangers. These stories can encompass and consume entire countries and cultures, large swaths of the world all telling the same anecdotes around campfires, children all cowering in fear as similar tales are regaled. Growing up on the South Shore of Massachusetts, there was the Whispering Man. The Whispering Man was a story that I had first heard from my uncle. It was the summer before I started kindergarten, prime time for scaring a child into behaving well. My mother had brought us out camping by a lake in New Hampshire with her brother and his family for Labor Day weekend, sending off the summer with a last hurrah. The first few hours were spent by the adults setting up the campsite, while my cousin and I were tasked with gathering firewood and kindling. My younger brother was excluded from our expedition due to him being deemed too young to join us. My cousin and I wandered the forest around the campsite, finding sticks and twigs that we used to battle one another in a mock Star Wars-style lightsaber duel before ultimately putting them into a basket to bring back to our campsite. Our laughs and giggles echoed throughout the forest, ultimately letting our parents know that we were safe and sound. Living in the suburbs, I had become accustomed to buildings lining the streets, small shops and strip malls scattered about main roads. Plant life, such as trees and grass, only belonged in the front and backyards of houses on side streets. I was enamored by the forest, the way the trees stood sturdy and strong. The grass was overgrown, untouched by tools like lawnmowers and weed whackers. I could have never imagined the sun could be entirely blocked out by the natural parasol that the leaves from the trees provided, and yet, there it was, infinite shade. During our journey, my older cousin, Ivan, asked me if I knew about the Black Volga. I nodded, as it seemed our grandmother educated all of her grandchildren about the dangers of strangers in strange cars. Babusha made that up, you know. Nah, I responded. She wouldn't lie to us. Why would she make that up? That way we don't talk to strangers. Think about it. She never talks about anybody that she knows who got taken by one. And do you even know what a Volga is? I've never seen one. As easily swayed as my child mind was, I started to put stock in what my cousin said. Do you want to hear a real scary story? Fear and excitement danced in my eyes before a small wave of apprehension washed over me. How do I know that it's real? If Babusha tells a fake story, then why would you tell a real one? Because my dad will tell it, and he says that he actually knows someone who it happened to. Later that night, we gathered around the campfire where Ivan and I were able to enjoy the fruits of our labor. The sun had set hours before, leaving our campsite illuminated solely by our fire and the stars above us, untouched by light pollution. I caught myself staring into the sky, craning my neck, allowing myself to feast my eyes on the stars that dotted the heavens above me. If you stay like that, your neck will get stuck and you'll look like that forever, my mother warned, sitting beside me. My brother was fast asleep in her arms, leaving myself, my mother, uncle, and cousin sitting around the campfire, wide awake and enjoying the nature that engulfed us. The darkness of the night crept towards us as the fire ran low on fuel, suffocating as it ate away at the logs, sticks, and twigs I had so diligently gathered. The warmth it provided waned as the chilling wind from the trees forced itself onto my back, causing the muscles to convulse as I shivered. In this moment, my cousin looked at his father. "Dad, tell the story about the whispering man." My mother cocked her head and spoke to her brother in a language I didn't understand. Despite her best efforts, I never quite picked up the language passed down to her by her mother. My uncle responded in the same language, leaving Ivan and I completely out of the loop. My mother smiled and urged her brother to indulge his son's request. "Go on, Kolya, tell the story." My uncle smiled and nodded. When Lyudmila and I were little, we grew up near a small patch of woods that was in our friend's backyard. His name was Travis. The trees in the woods weren't nearly as big as the trees here. He gestured all around us, pointing towards the still giants that loomed over us. The trees there stuck out of the ground like fingers that were ready to grab you at any moment. He grabbed onto his son who sat next to him. Ivan nearly jumped out of his skin. Lyudmila, Travis, and I all played in the woods together often enough. We even made a small fort one year. It took us the entire summer. One day we stayed out too long playing in the forest. It was dark out, and the three of us were playing around the fort deep in the woods. Suddenly the crickets stopped chirping, and the wind stopped blowing, and we heard a voice. A child's voice. "Come play with me," it said. Lyudmila and I were terrified. We ran out of the fort, and we ran home as fast as we could. But when we came out of the woods, Travis wasn't with us. My uncle bowed his head and sighed before continuing. The voice we heard in the woods at night was that of an evil in this world, the Whispering Man. He walks around the woods at night looking for children to play with him. He draws them in and tricks them, inviting them to play. My shivering persisted. No longer was it motivated by a change in temperature. Instead, the rapid muscle contractions were fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. I spoke up, a frail voice that shattered against the progressively chilling air. Where was Travis? He was with the Whispering Man. We never saw him again, aside from the missing posters that were put on all the telephone poles in our neighborhood. He paused for a while. The chirping of the crickets and the crackling of the dying fire were the only sounds emanating from the forest. If you boys ever hear voices from the forest, you don't follow them. Understood? Ivan and I emphatically nodded in agreement, and my uncle poured his water over the fire, finally putting it out of its misery. A plume of gray smoke was released from the blackened logs and twigs. Its dying breath wafted into the air before dissipating into the sky above. That night I spent the majority of the time listening as the wind gently swayed the branches of the trees. The leaves whistled almost as if they were trying their hardest to speak, but their own anatomy simply wouldn't allow it. My eyes were forced open by my overactive imagination. As I watched the faint shadows waltz against the tent, I could have sworn that some of them shifted and morphed into the shape of a man. The chirping of the crickets combined with the whipping of the wind created unintelligible whispers in the night. Whispers that I feared belonged to the Whispering Man. I cowered in fear, allowing the sea of horror that had been built up inside of me to thrash me around. My head spun. The Whispering Man isn't real, I thought. Play with me. The voice penetrated through the thin plastic that acted as my sole line of defense. I retreated into a ball, deep in my sleeping bag, keeping one eye fixed on the zipper that acted as the only point of entry. There against the plastic, I saw a hand reach down towards the zipper outside the tent. My heart raced. I held my breath for as long as my still developing lungs would allow, and when they failed me, my breath became shallow and fleeting. The sound of the zipper forced itself into the tent, and the moonlight seeped into my tent. He isn't real. He isn't real. He isn't real. The thought repeated countless times. Reprieve washed over me as enough moonlight gave way to illuminate Avon's face. He began to laugh, and he whispered, "Got you." Before I could respond, he quickly zipped the tent back up, encasing me in darkness, and he returned back to his tent. The years passed and gave way to several changes in life. My family had moved away from my early childhood home and into a small apartment after the housing crash in '08 caused us to lose the house after my mom was laid off and our house went into foreclosure. Luckily for myself and my brother James, we were able to stay in the town that we grew up in. Although we lost the friends that we knew from our old neighborhood, James and I were given the opportunity to make new friends in our new home. Once we moved in, our new neighbors were quick to meet us and incorporate them into the fold that they had built over the course of a decade. And although we were new, they never thought of us as strangers. The kids in our new neighborhood, aside from James and I, were Michael, who was just about a year older than James, and Eddie, who was only a couple months older than me. Michael and Eddie had lived in this neighborhood their entire lives. They told us stories of the way things used to be before we arrived. Stories of massive games of manhunt before other kids moved away, and all the stupid things that they got up to. But those times were gone, and although they never said it, they were excited for the new memories that we would make together. Mere weeks after James and I had moved in, the four of us were inseparable. Anywhere one of us went, we all went together. Our parents called us the Four Musketeers. The summer before I entered high school when I was 14 and James was 11, the four of us spent our days running around the neighborhood, finding roofs of different buildings that we could climb onto near our houses, having airsoft wars in the woods, swimming in the small above-ground pool in Eddie's backyard, and at night we'd gather around the fire pit in Michael's backyard. We'd eat s'mores, and it was there that I'd retell the urban legends and scary stories that had consumed my attention. One night, as we sat around the fire, James asked, "Okay, Paul, which story are you going to tell us this time?" I began running through the Rolodex in my head of each story I had read from my editions of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, High Beams. No, I told that one last week. The Hook. No, that was the other day. Where Do You Come From? No, I've already told that one 3 times. Then I remembered. The Whispering Man. I have a new one, I announced, beaming with pride. No fucking way you have one that you haven't told us at least twice. Eddie scoffed while leaning back in his chair. I do, the Whispering Man. Each of them shared the same expression of puzzled intrigue. 3 kids who grew up in a neighborhood just like this one were playing in a small patch of woods behind one of their houses. Their parents always warned them to come home before dark, but one night they didn't listen. They stayed out in the woods near a little fort that they had built themselves out of log sticks. The 3 of them were each telling scary stories to see who could tell the scariest, creepiest one. Suddenly all the normal nighttime noises were gone, as if all the bugs and animals vanished. Then they heard a little girl's voice. "Come play with me," it said. And 2 of the kids ran out of the woods. They ran as fast as they could, but when they came out, their friend wasn't with them. He was gone. He vanished out of thin air, just like the bugs and the animals. And to this day, nobody has seen him. Where did you get that lame-ass story? Laughter erupted out of the group, to include myself. Once we had finally composed ourselves after Eddie's comment, I managed a response. My uncle told my cousin and I the story when we went camping when I was like 5 or 6. According to him, the 3 kids in the story were him, my mom, and their friend Travis. I did some research, and turns out it's some local legend in the area that started after a whole bunch of kids went missing. One of the missing kids was named Travis. I think my uncle just threw his name in the story to make it seem like it was a true story. Well, I hope he told the story better than that, James chided. The subject of discussion quickly changed to the new airsoft pellets that Michael's dad had bought him for his birthday. We all gathered around them in fascination for one simple reason. They glowed in the dark. Once the fire had died out, and there was nothing but the dim streetlight that fought to illuminate the area with no assistance from the moon and the stars, which were shrouded by the overcast sky above, we began to shoot the brand new pellets in the backyard as random targets that we found about the yard. We stood around in awe as we saw the pellets rip through the air towards the targets. "Michael, how many of these pellets do you have?" James asked. My dad bought 2 jugs of 1,000 pellets. The 4 of us went silent, and although no words were spoken, we all knew the exact thoughts of the others, and at that point we simply waited for someone to blurt out the idea first. "Airsoft war?" Eddie asked the question as if it was rhetorical. Eddie never received an audible response from any of us, but our actions were all he needed. Immediately after he asked the question, James and I went into our shared bedroom and grabbed our airsoft guns and ran back outside and onto our side street and waited for Eddie and Michael. Although our mother was apprehensive about allowing us to have our airsoft guns, after enough begging and pleading, she bought us each a $20 gun. They were cheap, clear plastic handguns, and the plastic allowed for us to see the inner mechanisms that allowed us to shoot small plastic balls at each other. She did have 2 conditions in order for us to keep our guns. The first was that we never fire them in the house. The second was that we only use them during the day, so they couldn't be mistaken for a real pistol. While we waited for Eddie and Michael, James began to have some apprehensions about our expedition. What if Mom finds out that we were playing with our guns at night? She won't find out, dude. She's on the night shift. She won't be home until 1 in the morning. So long as we're back before then, we'll be fine. James was relieved, but only slightly. I could tell he was still nervous, regardless of my attempt to reassure him. His apprehensions vanished once Eddie and Michael met us outside of our house, and we made our way to the woods. About a 5-minute walk away from our neighborhood was a small cemetery that had been reclaimed by nature. The sands of time had eroded the headstands that were left standing, to the point where very few names could be seen, and the names and dates that were legible had been long forgotten. Trees split and cracked several headstones. The grass was overgrown and it sprawled out of the land it diligently took back from man. The chain-link fence that encased the cemetery had been completely taken over by oxidation, leaving the iron a sickly shade of brown. The cemetery itself was split in half by a dirt path in the valley between 2 small hills. It wasn't the large plot of land typical of cemeteries, but instead it was maybe a half-mile long and a quarter-mile wide. There were 2 entrances into the cemetery. One led to a main road, and the other led into the parking lot of a private school. We walked through the parking lot and into the cemetery, and began to discuss the rules to our little war. One rule always stayed the same: no aiming for the head. This time we decided to play in teams. Michael and I were against James and Eddie. We each loaded our guns with the glow-in-the-dark pellets, and James and Eddie began to count to 30, giving Michael and I a head start. As we began running away, I instructed Michael to go onto the opposite hill that I went to. That way, if either of them finds one of us, the other can try and take them out. He followed my instructions, and we were soon situated on the peaks of each individual hill, scanning the ground below for potential targets. I cocked my airsoft gun and kept my finger on the trigger as I scanned the area. Eddie and James had finished counting and were trying to hunt down me and Michael. I laid down in the tall grass. My eyes were peeled, but in the dark woods I was lucky to see 15 feet in front of me. There was a dim light in the distance from the streetlights on the main road, but it was nowhere near strong enough to penetrate through the leaves from the trees. My ears quickly adapted to the silence. The chirps of the crickets and the sound of mosquitoes buzzing around me filled my ear canal and forcefully banged against my eardrums. I had to periodically slap different parts of my skin that the mosquitoes had buried themselves into in order to keep them off of me. Through the leaves of the trees, in the dying light of the street lamp, I saw a man walking down the sidewalk. I couldn't make out much, if any, details about his physical appearance. At first glance, the way he walked seemed normal, but the slight idiosyncrasies were uncanny. His gait was more akin to an uneven hobble, as if he was limping, but the limp seemed to shift from one leg to the other, like he couldn't decide which leg to bear the weight on. His arms didn't sway naturally. They stayed pinned to his side. I watched as he approached the tall, old, white picket fence gate with chipped paint, and it was there he stood completely still. It came in waves. The gentle breeze that gracefully walked across my back previously now stood at attention, and it seemed as though the air attempted to bring my body into the earth beneath me. The small animals that were moving around the tall grass all stood perfectly still, as if they were all suddenly taxidermized. The bugs and birds that were singing the song of the night all stopped in unison in an orchestrated silence. The deafening silence left a vacuum in my ears, and the only sound that I could hear was that of my own blood circulating through my ears as my pulse steadily increased. My eyes were fixed on that gate, and it felt like I was frozen in time. The silence was violently cut by a painful shrieking of the gate into the cemetery as it was slowly peeled open. Slow-moving footsteps painfully forced themselves onto the dirt path below them. As they got closer, I was able to make out more of the unknown man's details. His skin was pale and clung onto the bones underneath them, and I couldn't find a single hair on his body. His nose was abnormally long, prominently protruding out from his face and coming to a knife's tip at the end. He was dressed in jeans and a pristine ironed long-sleeve button-up shirt. The sleeves were neatly rolled to his elbows, revealing his forearms. The skin on his arms was so tight that I could see the separation of the two bones in the forearms. He stood still, no less than 20 feet ahead of me. He tilted his head back ever so slightly and opened his mouth. "Hey, come over here. I found them." I never saw his lips move after he opened his mouth. It was like he had a speaker in the back of his throat that projected his message out into the air at a volume just above a whisper. "They're here. Come here." The voice rang out once more into the dead air. On the second listen, I came to a realization that chilled my bones and sent goosebumps throughout my body. The voice coming out of the man's mouth was Eddie's. My breath was shallow. I could barely keep my arms up, as though they were crushed by their own weight. My hands were now plagued by tremors, and I was entirely unable to keep my gun steady, and from the corner of my eye I saw James's silhouette lurking towards the man, towards the false version of Eddie's voice. I did the only thing I could think to do. I took aim and fired my airsoft gun at the man. I watched the luminescent green speck rip through the air, and it maintained a course straight for the man's head. The sound of the burst of air escaping my small plastic pistol rang out, bringing life back to the world around me. The pellet made contact with the man's head. He turned his head towards me. His cold, beady, black eyes cut through my own. I clamped my eyes shut. The vice of childlike logic of, if I can't see it, it can't see me, rapidly bounced around my brain. Footsteps rapidly pounded against the ground, bounding in my direction, and then I felt the unmistakable sting of a plastic pellet hitting my side. "I got Paul!" James yelled out, beaming with pride. I opened my eyes. The man had vanished, and James was standing over me. Relief had reinvigorated my body, allowing strength to return to my legs, and as I stood, another burst of air sent another pellet ripping through the air and into James's chest. Another shot brought the silence of the cemetery to its knees, and I heard Eddie's voice boom across the small valley and into the night. Fuck! Michael had won us the round. My apprehension towards staying in the cemetery grew insurmountably, and I urged the group to stop with our festivities. I lied and said that my mother had texted me, letting me know that she was getting off from work early. Luckily for me, they didn't call my bluff, and we all returned home. James and I went up to the small room that we shared. Our bedroom was 12 feet. 8 feet. With 2 windows that looked out onto the street from the second floor of our small apartment. We had bunk beds, which were placed against the back wall. I got into the top bunk, and James got into the bottom bunk. Sleep didn't come easily that night. It repeatedly slipped from my grasp like sand through a sieve. Once I finally found sleep, it was swiftly interrupted by the sound of intermittent and uneven tapping against glass. I sat upright and crawled my way to the end of my bed, towards the window. As I approached, I saw a small green speck bounce off the window. The glow in the dark airsoft pellet. I looked out the window, down onto the street, and there he was. The only thing that had changed about his appearance was that he now had a small welt on his right cheek. He walked towards where the pellet landed, picked it up, and threw it against my window once more. It banged against the window with a surreal amount of force. A small chip appeared in my window, and in the faint reflection that I forced my eyes to bring into focus, the chip in the window was against my cheek, my right cheek. I forced myself to the back of my bed, my head against my pillow. I attempted to burrow myself deep into my mattress, to no avail. The tapping continued for several minutes before abruptly stopping. I heard the sound of tires against the rocky dirt outside my house. The flash of headlights flooded into the room. The car door opened and closed, and soon so did my front door. My mother was finally home, and I no longer had to rely on the faux safety of the blanket for protection. I finally found sleep, however, it was far from peaceful. My dreams were plagued by the man's presence. I repeatedly found him in my peripheral vision throughout my dreams. I dreamt that he followed me. He was around corners, behind doors, in the back of rooms that I was in. His mouth would open, come outside, play with me. The list of voices in his arsenal weren't familiar to me, and for that I was thankful. He made promises, how I'd never be grounded. I'd never have to worry about rules, no curfew, and no punishments. If I close my eyes and allow myself a few brief moments of silence, I can still hear his final words to me. I'll come back for you, Paul. The voice was warped and raspy, as if it was a new voice added to his collection that he was trying out for the first time. It was an attempt at James's voice. I woke up that morning in a cold sweat. My shirt was drenched, and it clung uncomfortably to my body. I jumped out from the top bunk to find my brother's bed empty and unmade. I walked out of my room and into my mother's. She was still dead asleep, recovering from the long night of work. I got to the top of the stairs to find the front door slightly ajar, the cool morning air spilling into the house. I walked down the stairs and closed it. I walked into the living room, empty, the kitchen, empty, the bathroom, empty. Panic set in. Where is James? I thought. I began to frantically double-check each of the 5 rooms in the house, causing enough noise to wake my mother up in the process. I ran next door to Michael's house and rapidly banged on the door as if I was a police officer about to start a raid. His mother answered the door in pajama pants and a bathrobe, still rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. She told me that James wasn't over there, and I should probably check Eddie's house before allowing panic to take hold, but it was too late. Panic already had its hand wrapped tightly around my throat. Every breath I took from then on was labored. I sprinted to Eddie's door, praying that James had simply ventured over there earlier than usual. I made a feeble attempt at collecting myself and banged on Eddie's door, much the same way I banged on Michael's. Eddie answered the door. A look of irritation smeared across his face. "Bro, do you know how early it... Is James here?" The words escaped my mouth at such a rapid pace that he had to pause to comprehend what I'd said. No, why would he? When was the last time you saw him? I was hyperventilating now, panic's grasp growing tighter and tighter against my windpipe. When you guys went home after the airsoft war? Why? He's not home, and he's not at Michael's either. Eddie's eyes widened. His facial expression shifted from irritation to confusion to panic, all within an instant. He told me to run back home and see if James's phone was still there. Maybe he had gone somewhere without any of the rest of us, however unlikely that seemed. He said that he would get Michael out of bed and they'd start running around checking all the usual spots that we'd hang out. We promised to keep each other updated, and we split up to begin our search. I found James's phone on his bed in the mess of blankets and sheets that had been shifted around. His screensaver was a picture of the four of us, all together on the roof of a convenience store. We all looked so proud of ourselves. I opened his phone, no calls, no text messages, nothing that screamed, "Run away." I woke up my mother, and when I told her that I couldn't find James, she immediately sat up and sprung out of bed to begin her own search throughout the house, our backyard, and our neighborhood as a whole. Soon, everyone, including Eddie's and Michael's parents, had organized a small search party. The police were called that morning. A swarm of cop cars descended upon our neighborhood. I answered a flurry of questions that night. At first, I was apprehensive about admitting that we played in the woods the night before, out of fear of reprisal and punishment from my mother. As I look back on it now, especially from the lens of a parent, that didn't matter. I told them about the man outside the window, but I didn't tell them about the different voices he used in an attempt to lure me out. I didn't say anything about his final words to me through the window. I didn't say anything about him using James's voice. Soon the entire town was buzzing with police officers, passing out flyers with James's school picture from the year before. Hundreds upon hundreds of flyers were given out, but nothing ever came of it. The police told us that they had found a lead a couple of times in the first couple of months, but they dried up quickly. The sands of time eroded the hope I had of ever seeing my brother again. It's been nearly a decade since I last saw him. I'm honestly not sure what makes me angrier nowadays, the fact that I couldn't protect him, or the fact that I can't remember his face without seeing a picture. Some days I wish that I had just gone outside when I saw the man tossing the plastic pellet against my window. So it's here that I submit to you all another legend based on a horrifying truth, the Whispering Man. And to James, if you're still out there, and if you read this, please come home. I miss you, and although I never said it while you were here, I love you. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the dark and mysterious world of urban legends. The story of the Whispering Man is just one of many that show how deeply fear can root itself in our childhoods and how those stories stick with us, haunting us long after the campfires have burned out. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more legends and creepy tales, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on the next spine-chilling video. Stay curious, stay safe, and until next time, beware of the whispers in the dark.